So welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good investment as well in the 3 minutes. So I see Simon already started and sharing his presentation. So Simon, are you ready to go?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So give it away.
Thank you, Christian. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to hear that we were able to break the 2,000 registrants number. So it's truly amazing to have so many of you here from the Windows Virtual Desktop and EUC community today. So thank you for being a part of it, and the same to all of my community friends that have presented so far today. It's been great. So my session will focus on management of Windows Virtual Desktop and the integrations with primarily Microsoft 365, but also some other Azure services and Microsoft services in general. But it would also cover the changes you as an IT administrator need to make and do to get the most out of WVD and be successful in using it. And I often think of WVD like this. To be able to build a great house, or an office for the matter, we need to have one or more really good architects that do design, that do use the different third-party and first-party solutions. Bas presented a number of them, and I'll be presenting on a few of them. We also need tools, materials, money, and time. But all of that is put to no good use if we don't have a team of architects, so experts in their respective field that makes the blueprints for you. And now imagine that you're able to get access to completely new tools and brand new materials. Wouldn't the architects need to change the way they design the house then? Learn the new tools and how they're able to use them to form the material. And it's the same with WVD. And you are the architects and the builders and the users of it. So therefore today, I'll show you especially the tools that you can use to manage the new material, which in this case is WVD. The tools are in some case old, and a few of them are new, either completely or they are new to you perhaps. And I'll also help you choose your tools, because there are more than one tool that may suit you. And lastly, I'll challenge you. I will challenge you to change for the better. I will challenge you not to get stuck in old wheel tracks, and I will challenge you to get the most out of WVD, the WVD and the revolution that it's driving. So who am I then? My name is Simon. I'm a Microsoft Endpoint Manager MVP. I work as a principal technical architect at TrueSec. We are focusing on secure workplaces and secure infrastructures, as well as cybersecurity in general. I'm 1/3 of the podcast and blog that goes under the name of Knee Deep in Tech. And I'm from Sweden, from a small town called Linköping. And if you haven't heard about Linköping, it's famous for two things. We have one of Sweden's biggest chocolate factories, as well as the factory where what's possibly could be the world's best fighter jets are made. And other than that, I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, Pluralsight author, and I absolutely love penguins, and therefore I consider myself a real penguin fanatic. And before I begin, I have some housekeeping. Christian and his colleagues and the rest of the speaker group will continue to answer questions in the chat, and I'll of course help out with those after I finish my session. And if you don't get your questions answered, just feel free to reach out to me in any way you like. You will get my contact details in the end of the session. And you're more than welcome to have the sessions, of course. I don't see why, but if you would need them, you can get them. And there are a bunch of great pictures in the slides, so that would perhaps be a reason to get them. But let's start with something that I spoke about already now close to 2 years ago at the first conference where I presented on WVD. And that's how WVD democratizes EUC, because that's really what drives me and why I'm passionate about WVD. Because WVD is an end user compute solution that scales both up, which is what we usually talk about. We are always talking about how big our environments are, how many hosts we do have, and how much performance they do consume. But to me, it's also important to consider that WVD scales down as well, that WVD actually fits not just the big organizations, but also the smaller ones. And I would say that that also impacts the tools you choose to manage WVD. But first and foremost, so what do we need to consider in terms of how we're managing it, just from a general point of view? We have been managing Windows servers, so basically a Windows multi-session environment for quite a while. But once we go into Azure and WVD, we need to think in other ways. We perhaps don't need to put as much time into branding it or configuring the user interface for it to look at Windows 10, because it really is Windows 10. But it's not really Windows 10. And once we go into the other tools, I'll show you how the operating system from a tools point of view works. Another thing we need to consider in terms of how we manage it is Azure. Azure isn't like your own data center. In Azure, things cost money. I would say that it's worth it if you scale it correctly to your needs. But do remember that time is money in Azure. And we'll get back to that when we talk about, as an example, patch management. We have seen a number of different ways we can optimize the cost in Azure, but that's definitely something to take into consideration. And lastly, we don't have access to hardware. We don't have access to UEFI. And I know that I'm working quite a lot with Windows Autopilot as well. And I know that some of my customers first said that, oh, that's great. That's something we could use for WVD. But since we can't have access to anything in the VM prior to it actually booting, we need to use the tools we have access to. We can benefit from the hardware, like Thomas described earlier, but we are also, in some cases, constrained on how we use it. But in the end of the day, people and not technology will be the judge of how well we have done our job. And therefore, we also need to consider the user experience, which all of my colleagues here today have spoken about. And that's both the user experience from your colleagues, the people that actually are consuming what you configure and provide them with, but also your user experience as an administrator. So we'll start to talk about the technology aspects of this, and we'll start with the infrastructure. So everything from the identity services to how we can secure access to WVD. I have seen that we have had a couple of questions in regards to conditional access, so that's something I'll show first and foremost. But there are some other aspects of the infrastructure that we need to take into consideration. Second, manageability. So how do we actually configure our Windows Virtual Desktops hosts once they are deployed? How can we service them with applications? How can we update them? How can we control them? How can we report on them? We have seen a couple of options already, and I'll show some others that perhaps are more connected to how you have been managing your physical machines up until today, because that's also something to take into consideration. I often get the question, especially from people that have been managing Citrix or VMware environments previously, that how do we provision new devices? How do we spin them up? And I'm just saying, yeah, we're installing them. So in many ways, we perhaps need to learn from how we're managing physical devices and apply the best of those technologies to WVD, and take the best from the traditional EUC world and apply that to WVD as well. And we need to make it simple. One of the aspects of WVD to me is that it should be simpler than the environment you have today. That's one of the selling points of it as a whole. That's one of the selling points of the public cloud as a whole. You shouldn't be spending as much time on managing it as you previously were. So let's start with the infrastructure and it's about, again, democratizing EUC. So I'll show you a couple of different ways for smaller organizations, bigger organizations, on how to manage this. And will always be challenges. One of the challenges that we still currently have, and which we'll talk about in just a second, is the single sign-on to WVD if you don't have ADFS. But I'll elaborate on that in just a few seconds. So the options we have for the identities in WVD are as follows. We need to have an AD some way or another. The devices need to be joined to an AD. And we have three real options there. We have the Azure AD domain services, which is basically a domain running as a service in Azure that synchronizes to your Azure AD. You can still have your own AD on-prem and synchronize that to Azure AD and then synchronize it again to domain services. But if you have that set up, you also have the option, which I'm running in my environment, where I'm actually combining the second two. You can have a VPN connection between your Azure environment and your local environment and let your VMs connect back to your on-prem domain controllers. That then could be proven challenging if you lose connection to Azure, but that's one of the options if you really want to minimize cost especially. And the third option is that you run a DC in the cloud. But once we want to authenticate to WVD, we also need to authenticate to Azure AD. And I'll now show you how that works. I'll show you how conditional access is applied to these different connections. And I'll show you the different experiences which depends on how we are connecting our Azure AD with our local AD. So first and foremost, I'll start off by showing the web client. So this is a regular Windows 10 machine. And in my case, I'm logging on with an account, sorry. Okay, that's odd. Let's do it like this then. And this user is synchronized from my local domain to Azure AD. And this account is configured to get an MFA if it logs on to on a Windows machine, regardless if it's using the browser or the agent. So now I need to authenticate, and I'm using that by leveraging the Azure Authenticator app. And we'll get into how we can configure conditional access later on. So I sign on with the same account, the same username as I would use in my local domain or my Azure AD, and we'll start an app. So depending on how your environment is set up, how many session hosts you have, and how you have distributed your different apps, you may be faced with this screen. And this could be looked at in two different ways, because what happens now is that since I'm not using ADFS to federate my Azure AD and my AD, I'm now again asked to sign into the actual VM running this app. And this is something that I know that the team is working on, which we'll hopefully see an improvement to soon. Because in my opinion, if you don't have any good reason to run ADFS as your federation service, you should definitely look into password authentication or just password hash synchronization instead for that connection between AD and Azure AD. But currently, if you're running anything other than ADFS, you will need to authenticate once more per VM. And of course, this could be considered something that would decrease the user experience, and definitely it does. But there can also be use cases where you perhaps would like to authenticate to the service first with one account, and then authenticate with another account to access apps, as an example. So I won't log in here now because we'll look at this account from another machine instead. So that's one experience. The other experience, and I'm happy that Bas mentioned IGEL, because I actually have an IGEL client, a virtual IGEL client running here as well. And we can start the WVD agent from here as well. And again, I get an MFA request. But this is one of the things that are, or I should get one at least. I think the agent perhaps failed on me. So we'll restart that and revisit it later on. But we have two different operating systems here. And it's not necessarily so that I would like the same experience when I'm connecting from a thin client as I would like from a Windows client. And that's something that may have been a bit of a struggle previously, depending on your setup, where you perhaps always were enforcing MFA, perhaps also in places where you didn't need it. And that's really what conditional access is all about. So to show that, and conditional access is something we configure usually in Microsoft Intune, I have two policies set up. So let's start with the Linux one. And this is where it gets slightly complicated. Conditional access isn't like any other tool because you really need to plan and think on how you will be using it. So by using Intune, you configure, okay, in which way should my settings from conditional access be applied? So you configure which groups that should be included and excluded. You configure which apps. And in the case of WVD, these are the two apps that you could configure. So the client side and the server side. And then you configure conditions. And this is where it gets interesting with Linux. Since Linux isn't one of the platforms that are able to fully use all the options in conditional access, or for the matter Intune today. So in this policy, which will be applied to Linux or really any other unsupported operating system, is that the policy will apply to any device apart from Android, iOS, Windows Phone, Windows, and Mac OS. So we need to think in reverse. So this policy will apply to any device which isn't in the exclusion list. And to get access to those two services we configured, we require multi-factor authentication. And we can then use a number of other settings as well. But these other ones are mainly or only really for the devices that are supported, device types that are supported. But we could therefore add other conditions to say that, yeah, any Linux client which is in a location that we trust should not have MFA enforced on it. I also have a second policy then, because since we excluded all the Windows and Mac devices and so on, we need to configure the security settings for those as well. So in my other policy, I have therefore included these selected operating systems. So in this way, we can enforce different security postures depending on where devices are, how they connect, and how the device they connect from looks. And we had a question on how we can make users re-authenticate, and it's really not authenticating to different host pools, but you could enforce session controls that would enforce a higher sign-in frequency, which would then re-evaluate the conditional access requirements in a more continuous way. And you can put that down to once every hour if you so desire. Moving back to one of the other challenges with infrastructure is networking. And Azure networking, I really admire people that are good at Azure networking. I'm not particularly good at Azure networking, but I do realize that depending on where you are in the world, you may not be as close to an Azure data center as Christian in Amsterdam is, as an example. So therefore, you need to take some other things into consideration. And this isn't really something new. It's just that if you haven't had your EUC environment, regardless of which technology you have based it on, that far away from your applications previously before trying out WVD, you may experience some challenges. So therefore, I encourage you to try your applications before publishing them to your users. If the client side of an application gets too far away from a server side, how does that impact? It's not necessarily so that it will be a worse experience, but in some cases it will. On the other hand, the upside of having WVD in Azure, especially if you're running Office 365, is that your Office 365 data resides very, very close to your WVD host. So one thing you could try, which I really like and which is really cool, especially combined with the FSLogix technology, is that if you open up a WVD host, you install the OneDrive agent, the machine-wide, of course, and you make some of your files available offline. You will see that if you have your Office 365 tenant in the same region as you have your WVD hosts, you will get a really good download speed from OneDrive, from SharePoint, from Exchange to your virtual machine, which you can then put away in an FSLogix container and create a really good user experience, even for very large files. And that combined with different storage services in Azure makes for a really good user experience. So there are some upsides and some challenges with hosting it in Azure, but it's about looking into, especially your apps, see which ones could be migrated. And that's something I definitely see as one of the drivers for some of my customers that, yeah, we want WVD. And therefore they realize that, yep, we can then move our apps to Azure as well. I usually recommend that they are looking into moving some of their infrastructure services on-prem to a platform service in Azure. But in some cases, they just want to lift and shift to get the best possible experience from their apps and WVD. We have spoken a lot about images. And since I'm a config manager guy since many, many years, I've had my share time creating images. And I know that there are people that find creating images like a therapy, or they actually enjoy it. If you're one of those people that enjoys creating images, good for you. But I personally see that we could do things another way. We have been shown a couple of different ways to do it, both using a couple of Azure tools, using third-party tools, community tools. But I'll be showing you another tool that really could take you to the next step in how you automate your images. And we'll be talking more about what you can use your images for, why you may need or may not need a golden image in just a few minutes. But first, we'll look into another way of building and automating your image building process. So we'll open up the Azure portal. I'll scale this down a bit. So we have a tool called Azure Image Builder in preview currently, which is using the Cloud Shell to build an image in an automated way. So let's see if I can find my, there we go. You configure a few settings, create a resource group, assign access rights to that, and then you choose download a JSON file, which I'll soon show you. And then you basically run one command. This will now create an image of a default image or your custom image if you so desire in Azure in a fully automated way. And since we are able to provide a JSON file to this image building process, we are fairly flexible in what we can do. So this is a sample file provided by Microsoft, and I'm using this just to show an example of what you could do. So in this particular case, we're building a Windows Server 2019. There are images for multi-session, Windows 10, of course. Then you should look for something like this for a JSON file. In this particular case, it's also including Office 365 Pro Plus, but it's also currently the latest Windows 10 release, as you can see in 19H2. So you're able to build both your server images, your Linux images, if you so desire, as well as your Windows images with this tool. So what you do is you choose your operating system. You choose what VM size should be used to build it. And then you can customize it. So in this case, the JSON file will ask the service to first run a PowerShell script. it will then, so first the PowerShell script, it will then do a restart and put a file down on that machine. That means, and if we combine this with chocolatey nougat or something like that, or you add your own files, your own JSON files, your own files to GitHub repository as an example, you can actually do a very, very high amount of automation, adding your applications, configuring settings, branding the image in any way you like. You can install Windows updates and a bunch of other things. And this means that you actually could automate a new build process of your images every single night or how often you desire, and integrate this in Azure DevOps or other tools to drive that automation. So we'll be talking about the use case of images in just a few minutes, but I encourage you to look into this and see if this suits your needs, if you need to build an image. Because you need to make a choice. And this is one of the things where you as an organization need to consider what's really important. If you want to have full control of your session hosts in Azure, you probably will need to have a more advanced tool. In my case, since I'm good at using Configuration Manager, I'm using Configuration Manager as well as a number of other tools. If you are a smaller organization or really don't have that much you want to configure on your devices, you could actually use Microsoft Intune, but that solution is currently only supported once you have a dedicated machine per user. So if you're using one machine per user, so a traditional like dedicated VDI machine, you can definitely use Intune. But the combination of Intune and Config Manager will also enable you to do a number of other things. The options we have, apart from Intune and Config Manager, which is two icons in the middle, is the other two. So the first one, furthest to the left, is that your users really want the same machine as they would get if they were to go out to any electronic store and buy a device. They want to be in full control of that machine. I'm not saying that that's advisable. It could be used in some cases, and if you really is a very small organization and you have other security measurements implemented, yeah, sure, you can get up and running really, really fast with the gallery images and let your users manage those the way they desire. So that's basically the least amount of management, but also the least amount of control, and perhaps also the least amount of security. We then have Microsoft Intune, which has a very limited use case currently, but works. And there are ongoing work on how to integrate that further, so stay tuned for that. But I've done some tests. It works if you have very low expectations on what you need to do. And that's not saying that it's a bad solution. It's just saying that you may not have the use case for all of the more advanced features that you would get in Config Manager, which in this case is represented by a VM. So Configuration Manager is since release 1910. Supporting WVD, and we'll be looking into that in just a second on how you can leverage Configuration Manager to manage your machines. But all of those three first ones really focuses on one thing. That's continuous management of your devices. And that's not really how we have been managing many of our virtual machines previously. Previously, we have been using our golden images, and we have basically thrown away VMs when they need to be updated or where apps need to be updated or something happens to them. And that's something you still could do. If you have a very smooth image building process, if you use the tools provided by the community or by third-party vendors, you can still do that today. Do consider that you still are redeploying new machines, so that will take some time. So it's dependent on how much you can automate your building process. But those are, in my view, the four options you have. And I would say that the one to the left are for the people, or the ones furthest to the left are for the organizations that haven't been managing these kinds of environments previously. Config Manager and a more advanced image building and image management process is for the ones that are used to this kind of environments. But now, let's look at how you can drive continuous innovation with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And I'll be showing that by talking about applications, and I'll be talking about patch management just briefly because I saw some questions in regards to that. So let's move on to my config manager environment. And I first and foremost would like to point out one thing that Christian tweeted a few weeks ago, I believe. So we'll soon be looking into the multi-session Windows 10 and see that it isn't like any other Windows 10 operating system. So Config Manager works with queries to build collections inside of Config Manager, and the collections is then populated with machines. In this case, I've created a query graciously provided by Christian. And it's just slightly tired. Because if we believe that we could use the same queries to get Windows 10 multi-session devices into our same collections as our single session ones, we are slightly wrong at least. It depends on how you do them. But if you want to create a query which only includes multi-session Windows 10, it needs to look like this. And the important thing to note here is system SKU is equal to 175. This will ensure that I only get systems that are multi-session Windows 10 in this collection. And the other we can actually do that. So if we take values, the 3 on top here is actually the Windows 10 releases that we are used to. And you can see that there's a slight difference in the numbers. So what else is a difference that we need to take into consideration? Well, if we look in our logs, and this is a log from one of my WVD clients, running in Azure, first one is this. This machine is not a workstation. It's quite obvious that it's running Windows 10, but from a config manager point of view, this machine is not considered to be a workstation. Oh, sorry. Second, this is the default behavior. User policy disabled on multi-user terminal server, which is in many cases good, depending on how much performance you put into it and how advanced your users are. You could decide to enable the user side of the configuration manager policies. But these are two things to take into consideration, that it's not seen as a workstation, and by default user policies is disabled. We can also actually look at the difference between, and this is a Hyper-V machine, so we can do queries and actually, queries and automate based on the virtual machine type as well. This is running in Hyper-V. And if we have another machine which runs in Azure, we can see that from a config manager point of view. It's a server. And we can easily see that it's an Azure virtual machine. So by understanding this, we can leverage the automation capabilities in Configuration Manager to provide our virtual machines with patches and applications as well. However, patch management of WVD can again be done in different ways. So we could use images, which takes time to build, which takes time to replace in host pools and things like that. But if we do patch management using Configuration Manager or Microsoft Intune, the machines will be running. And depending on how you pay for your Azure consumption, that may prove costly to you. So depending on how big your organization are, if you have paid upfront for Azure or is pay as you go, you may choose your patching solution based on that. But since there are limited options to use Azure Update Management today, I would consider to use Config Manager and Intune if it's not deemed to be too expensive to me. And I'll just show you how you can do with Intune as well, briefly. There we go. So if you haven't used the patch management capabilities of Microsoft Intune, it's actually getting quite advanced now. For WVD, I would probably say that depending on how the use cases are, again, for Intune, it's only dedicated personal devices. But I'll probably say that it should install and restart at a scheduled time. And once that's done, it would probably be asked to shut itself down for the night, perhaps. So with this configuration applied to one of these machines, you could tell it to every week or first week, second week, on any given day or a specific day at a specific time, install patches and restart. So therefore, you could build automation based on that as well. And this is, of course, also possible with Configuration Manager. But how do we get our devices into Intune or Configuration Manager? So the first thing to consider is that all machines that we have running in WVD needs to be domain joined. So therefore, to get them into Azure AD, and this is something I would encourage you to do anyways for the benefits of single sign-on and such, is to hybrid Azure AD join them. So we'll go to Azure AD. We should have a number of devices here. And as you can see, we have a few that are hybrid Azure AD joined. Let's see if we can find our WVD machines. It should be here somewhere. Too many devices. But we have hybrid Azure AD joined, and then in this case, they are managed by Microsoft Intune. And if we were to go into our other portal, we would see co-managed or managed by Configuration Manager. So the hybrid Azure AD join is configured using Azure AD Connect. So if you aren't using that today, I highly encourage you to do that, because that will give you, like I said, a number of benefits that could also drive conditional access rules. Once that's done, especially for Intune, but once they are in AD, we can push out a config manager client. Once they are hybrid Azure AD joined, or Azure AD joined for general physical machines, as an example, we would create a group policy. Which is now hidden. There we go. A group policy to automatically enroll into MDM. And those are your options to get your devices into Configuration Manager, into Intune, or into what's called co-management, where you manage devices with both Intune and co-management and Configuration Manager. But I think the absolutely most common word during this day have been ease of use, and therefore let Azure do the heavy lifting. Because if we let Azure do the heavy lifting, if we leverage the platform as a service offerings that we have in Azure, using Azure files, using perhaps Azure Active Directory domain services, using Azure DevOps, image builder, things like that, we are able, and this is my by far favorite picture of automation. This is what you get if you search for automation on my favorite picture site. You are able to spend less time managing your Windows Virtual Desktop environment than you were managing your on-prem environment. If you keep doing things the way many have been doing up until now, you will definitely run into a situation where you spend more time managing something. And if you do that, you won't get maximum value, and you will probably get a higher cost for your environment. So in every single choice you make in terms of choosing vendors, in choosing community tools, in choosing Microsoft services, ensure that you're able to automate as much as possible. Patching, application delivery, which definitely would be something to consider with Config Manager and MSIX App Attach combined. Ensure to always drive automation. But automation is not only about technology, because that also requires you to change your mindset. So Windows Virtual Desktop, it's a new technology, but in some cases it's not new at all. It's built on proven technologies. It's built on top of things you already know, but you may need to change the way you use your tools that you have been using previously. So don't feel afraid. You're still relevant. The things you have learned is still something that you could apply to Windows Virtual Desktop, but you may perhaps be doing it another way. Manageability to me is something that definitely puts this into play. We have seen like Bas introduced and Marcel and many of the other friends in this call introduced new tools, new techniques to manage Windows Virtual Desktop. So the things that are new in Windows Virtual Desktop may need new tools, and therefore you may need to change the way you think about it. And the challenge is really that. We have all the tools we need available. The challenge is really choosing your tool, choosing the tool that suits you and your organization, and see if you should change the tooling, the mindset, or keep doing what you always have been doing up until now. So the next step that I would encourage you to take is that take away what you have learned today from me, from my community friends, from the Microsoft speakers, and I know that Scott has some really exciting things to share as well. Take all of this with you. Go back to your organizations and make active choices. Just that you may have a domain controller running on-prem and no one in Azure doesn't say that you shouldn't have a domain controller in Azure. Yes, it's a cost. Yes, it's an extra domain controller, but that may be the most suitable solution for your organization. How should you deliver apps? We were given a number of options from Friek and Misha previously. You have all of those options. Should they be delivered by a third-party partner, or should they be delivered natively using group policy, configuration manager, or something else? Choose your virtual machines, like Thomas talked about previously. On-prem, you perhaps haven't had the option to have a GPU in your virtual machines for many of your users due to cost, as an example. In Azure, you have those options. It's still a cost, of course, but if you plan and design and are the architects that I'm sure you are, design it to suit your needs. And all of that requires a change of mindset. It requires you to think before you do. But if you do that, I'm definitely certain, and it's sad to see an airplane in these times, of course, but I'm definitely sure that you will be able not just to get into the cloud and use the game changer that Windows Virtual Desktop is. You won't only be able to democratize EUC and help out a community of passionate people, but you will also be able to provide your users with a really, really good user experience that will definitely make them take you to the clouds. Thank you very much. If there's any questions, any follow-ups, just please feel free to reach out in any way you like. Thank you for spending half a day with me and my community friends and my Microsoft friends. And I wish you a great rest of the day. And now I'm really excited to hear what Scott has to share with us. So thank you.